Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 32. Today we have an interview with Mr. Tim Nguyen, who is a senior VFX artist at Bungie, currently working on the Destiny franchise in Issaquah, Washington. He has worked on a variety of video game titles, including Halo, Rekoil, and Primal Carnage. Tim has humble beginnings in 3D art, which has quickly evolved into a love for driving emotional spectacle in VFX, and ultimately building memorable experiences for players. With that said, let's dive in.
Welcome to the Real-Time Visual Effects Podcast, the place to hear from some of the video game industry's most seasoned artists and up your game. Listen in on how you can learn and grow as a VFX artist, discover your own wizard, and network with hundreds of other talented magicians in the real-time visual effects community. Here is your host, Travis McCallum.
Hey, Tim. Glad to have you on the show today. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I woke up this morning and I decided to have breakfast. Today's a good day.
Yeah, what'd you have for breakfast?
Protein waffles.
Oh, that's delicious. With syrup or no? You eat them dry?
I found 0-calorie syrup things. I didn't know they existed, but my sister's really into it. So I grabbed it from Amazon and it's actually not bad. It doesn't taste like real syrup, to be honest, but they're just okay if you're wanting to compromise.
I had a iced mocha with whipped cream this morning. So, kudos to you for being healthy.
Cheers. Quarantine has been an interesting thing because I've had to really focus, in terms of self-care and well-being. So taking care of my health has been one of those weird priorities, including eating cleaner.
Yeah, I agree, man. Without any commute, you're literally moving from your bed to your computer chair to the couch and that's your routine, and you got to change it up. Tim, man, I want to touch base on some of these awesome projects you've done with Halo, Rekoil, and Primal Carnage, but I want to jump back to your origin story. When you were a little kid and you were growing up, what led you to get started in visual effects?
Oh man, this is kind of the most hilarious type of origin story because I never really imagined myself to be in visual effects because I guess I didn't know what visual effects was really about. So there was nothing for me to really aspire to until I learned really what visual effects are about. So as a kid, I was kind of a bit of a wild child, I grew up watching a lot of Jackie Chan movies. I thought I wanted to be a martial artist, when I was 5. I grew up in Hong Kong. I was born there until I was 6 or 7 years old. Then my family moved to Vietnam. My family is originally Vietnamese. I lived there for a good 7 years or so. Then I moved to Paris because my family is actually French. So I got to stay with basically half our family or whatever in the Paris region. And then when I graduated from high school, I decided that, hey, I want to work in video games. Why? Because I had a computer at home and I was one of those kids who didn't have a lot of pocket money, but I wanted to play free games. So I just downloaded every beta test MMO grind fest that I could and then just figure out how many months of free gaming I could get any given thing. I made a lot of friends and stuff. I understood the social component really well. At one point, I was just helping interpret for our clan between different languages. So I was interpreting between English, French, and Spanish. And then some other guy was interpreting between German, Swedish, Dutch, or something. It was kind of a crazy, hectic type of thing. But because of that, I started looking deeper into video games and understanding there was an art form towards it. So I kind of just knew there was a general area of game art. And at the time, a lot of the opportunities in schools were in the US. And my grandpa, from my mom's side, he lived in the US. So I decided to take a chance. I moved in with him. And I lived in Southern California for a bit, went through college and so on. Did a lot of industry networking and, a lot of group projects and stuff. Met a lot of really cool people. A lot of career opportunities also happened in that area. And at some point, I ended up in Washington because I guess that was the start of my AAA career opportunity over there. And the entire process, I still didn't know I wanted to work in visual effects. I was kind of waffling around between what I wanted to do. In school, I thought I wanted to be a concept artist, because when you're a kid, you kind of look at art books and that's how you understand game art by thinking, oh man, it's all about drawing. It's about painting. You just need to have a good idea to be able to get something in, which isn't really the case. It's kind of the starting point of building something cool and to collaborate with others. But I didn't know that. So I realized how hard it was to really draw and paint and to really communicate with people. So I thought, oh man, maybe game design is a bit more abstract or whatever. And I realized I was really terrible at that too. Game design is kind of this weird like witchcraft of like understanding systems and numbers and really understanding like, what drives players to like things. There's a whole bunch of like applied psychology that I'm not the best at, but I understand it to some extent. So I was like, oh man, maybe I should just stick to 3D modeling, maybe I should become an environment artist or something. And it turns out that that is an extremely saturated industry. A lot of very talented people are in there. And it was an extremely stressful time in my life trying to figure out, hey, how do I survive in this type of work environment? Been burned out a lot, over and over again. A lot of my opportunities were not really based off of my modeling skills. I'd say they were more really based off of like my ability to learn different things and to like apply technical knowledge in different areas, like optimization, shaders or whatnot. And even like, when I started working at Bungie or whatever, like I got in as a 3D generalist, I was kind of like this person that people went to for help them out like prototype things, so like a designer, building an entire activity and then working on all sorts of like scripting encounters or whatever. And then they need to have an asset, either representative or whatever, that could do basic things, like this thing explodes, this thing you shoot at it, this thing you interact with or whatever. So I was helping out do that and run through a lot of playtesting, making sure that, that the game was fun and whatnot. And slowly, like, we need to represent more and more that type of gameplay asset and content. And it turns out that visual effects is like really good or even like primary at understanding gameplay. How do players understand the virtual world they're working with? How do they understand like objects and whatever, signaling, status, warning triggers and so on and so forth. So at the time, I didn't really know how visual effects worked. So I just kind of tried to copy paste things here and there. I was like, all right, I'm going to grab, this existing effect and I'm going to, add it here, or I'm going to stub in like a laser. I'm going to stub in, glowing red bubbles or something. And those are good enough for like functional prototyping and stuff. But sometimes you had more complete assets like, oh, here's fire. I'm going to add fire here. And at some point, you have to also learn how to implement those features a bit better. So maybe, there'd be like a missing marker. So you had to add a marker and label things properly so that things would align properly. Maybe you had to orient, the effects based off of local space versus world space. Maybe you had to like rescale the size of the asset because this fire is too big compared to like this thing that was had to be smaller. Maybe the color is wrong. Maybe the color needs to change. And before you know it, you're literally authoring the visual effects asset. And then you gain more familiarity over time from just trial and error until you get better at like building things from scratch. We still try to recycle content as much as we can here and there. And just from the nature of like having a lot of requests related around visual effects asks, just doing those asks over and over again, it just became more and more formalized where, I'm a visual effects artist. I didn't realize I was a visual effects artist until then. Like I just kind of fell into it. I have this like working theory that like the entire visual effects discipline is like not only this crazy macro discipline of all these different things you need to accomplish at the same time, but it's also like a ghost pirate ship. It kind of sails in and abducts you because you're in the way, and then you're a part of this jolly gang trying to recruit more people into it.
Your story is incredible. And Tim, I'm listening to you and I'm just thinking everything that you did led you to where you are today. Your life experience traveling the world and becoming well-cultured in all these different countries and their traditions, your educational journey experimenting in these areas like 3D modeling and concept art. You've been able to amass this wealth of experience and become this generalist, which in essence, VFX is a generalist. We touch base in every single department within a game production pipeline. So you have this amazing gift to share animation, drawing, programming, all into one major job. And I love what you described as this ghost pirate ship idea. It really jams with me.
I'd say that it took me a long time to figure out how to get there. I guess one, like I didn't know that there was like a destination to this. I didn't really know that like I knew that visual effects was an actual job. I just didn't really understand the extent of that job. I just kind of understood at the time that if you wanted smoke or dust or whatever, then that's what visual effects is for. I didn't realize the extent or how involved visual effects was behind the scenes in terms of process. How do you make gameplay feel good? How do you communicate things clearly? How do you make sure that people feel certain things while playing the game versus not, I always kind of thought that visual effects was just kind of this thing in your face versus like this kind of subconscious thing that, really tackles at some level of the human psyche. And it took me a while to like build all these skills, I thought for a long time that I was kind of a failed artist in a sense, because I just never was really that good at anything. So it's any individual skill, kind of the saying of like jack of all trades, master of none. So I thought, hey, I'm just going to be somewhat mediocre or somewhat okay at different things. But it turns out that like sometimes the sum of these things, end up being greater than the whole. So like I'm happy that I ended up in this field. I just
Exactly.
took years to get there.
So to answer that question, as a visual effects artist, what is your role within a company or a project or a team? What's kind of that big philosophical question of our biggest contribution and our biggest purpose for existing as VFX artists?
I'd say that, as any artist on any commercial product or service or whatever, the emphasis for the entire release is often like, what the bullet point or what the target of that thing needs to be. So for example, if you're working in film, I would assume that like the primary criteria of what makes good visual effects is storytelling. It's the ability to create or establish emotional set pieces for the story to be able to make sense, to be able to carry people to that journey. When it comes to video games, I believe that like gameplay or even just the game experience itself is the criteria for artists and visual effects artists specifically to match up to. So it doesn't matter, like, for example, if you're just trying to make the most realistic smoke or the most realistic fire or whatever, if it doesn't communicate specifically what that intent is and players don't grasp it, then that's kind of like the job not finished. There's still a lot of polish in there for us as visual effects artists to make sure that we have that emotional appeal, but also that emotional takeaway from those experiences. Not all visual effects have to be like in your face. A common example would be like the muzzle flash from a gun. Like people kind of feel that more than they actually notice it, because if you notice the muzzle flash from a gun, then you're not paying attention to combat. You're not paying attention to all the other parts of the experience that makes it work. So as a visual effects artist, sometimes your job is to make things that are not directly noticeable by people versus other things, like, oh man, I want to discover something that inspires a sense of awe and wonder or whatever. Something of very high visual identity. That ends up being your job. Visual effects, it's a kind of a large area, and to define like any given person of what their entire role of visual effects is kind of difficult when it takes a team to be able to build these type of things.
So of the effects you've been able to work out on, whether they're the ones that evoke an emotional response to the player or they're just felt by them, is there any kind of effect that you've done on any game project that you have a lot of pride in? I did that effect. That's my stamp on that game.
I'm lucky that I get to work on a lot of like giant hero assets here and there. So whenever for a game like Destiny, we release things in seasons, and I get to kind of point out yeah, that giant thing was my thing. Like for one season, I built like some sort of giant what do I call it? Like a Vex thunderstorm ball portal thing in the sky that kind of exploded and spawned a bazillion types of units. And I thought that was really cool because that kind of thing had very hard criteria to build, but that kind of thing was so high visual, so high spectacle that it was kind of like a pride and joy moment of you see that thing that everyone else notices. I had some involvement in that. That's maybe one example of something I was kind of really proud of. But sometimes you build things that are kind of difficult to build behind the scenes, but most people won't be able to notice it because by design, it's not the absolute primary thing. In one of the earlier seasons, we had this giant pyramid ship, it cast some sort of resonance energy, some sort of influence onto a giant tree. And there was this barrier between what we call light and darkness, that was fighting against one another. So I had to figure out a way to kind of simulate, some sort of membrane threshold fluid or whatever. But obviously with real-time technology, you only have so many limitations here and there. So I just had to figure out the most brute force way to warp a lot of warp maps together. And from there, I was pretty proud of the solution I came up with, even though it was just more of a straightforward application of how to build that. So that was more personal pride of how I built a lot of the things behind the scenes.
That makes a lot of sense. Oftentimes, some of the effects we're most proud of may be because of the behind the scenes shader work that we spend, but the actual visual element doesn't show that as intensely. I'm always thinking of these next-gen games, Destiny obviously being one of them, but The Last of Us 2 and how they have this rope sequence going on in the background. And you would think, oh, a rope, being able to bend it dynamically and move it in lots of directions, that can't be that hard. But behind the scenes, it's actually a very big technical problem to manage.
Yeah, video games are kind of weird where sometimes things that seem super complex are relatively easy to create, but often it's like the simplest things that are super hard to build. I remember like in The Last of Us 2, there was this sequence where I think like one character was removing their shirt and was like wrinkling and crumpling everywhere. And that was like the most brute force way to ever have a character remove their shirt, but they just did it because they could.
What are some of the big trends you're seeing in the VFX industry for 2021?
Oh man, I'm really bad at staying up to date with trends. I do like pay attention to things, here and there, try to figure out, what's cool out there. I'd say that like, at least for a while up to 2021, I've seen a lot of like formalization of like different types of visual effects. I think mostly based on different styles. So for example, certain games or releases, they're very reliant on big simulations. You'd have a lot of flipbook textures, you'd have a lot of like big dynamics or whatever, versus others, they try to move away from like big simulation content. And they're really relying on like what I call like stylized animation, on timing, colors, readability. They're very like anime inspired, in terms of timing, whatnot. So personally, I'm more on the end of like trying to figure out or trying to notice opportunities where visual effects have an increased sense of player interaction and reactivity. I'm hoping to see a lot more real-time simulations on higher-end higher-end hardware, because there's still a sky is the limit view when it comes to visual effects about what can we do more with more CPU, more GPU power or whatever. So I'm hoping to see a lot more of that. What are the things that players can do in the game that other visual effects will react to or react with?
My girlfriend had asked me a question the other day. She said, why are they creating an Overwatch 2? Why not just create an expansion to Overwatch? And I had to think on that question for a second. And I said, okay, well, this game was created like in 2014. And since then, the Xbox has released a new system. The PlayStation has released a new system. The hardware has just increased so much. And if you're operating off of older gen systems, it's like when the Nintendo Wii kind of retired its games to move on to the Switch, you have to up your own software to match the new hardware that's out, because as game developers, we have to keep up with whatever hardware companies are out there, like the NVIDIA graphics card that recently came out, that 380, that is still sold out and I can't get a copy of. I think that's a big trend that a lot of us are seeing, is being able to just keep up with the technology.
For Overwatch 2, like, I don't know what their plans are, because obviously I don't work for that company. So I'm hoping as a consumer to see what kind of cool things they come up with. I do understand as a developer, though, that there's always some desire to reinvent the wheel sometimes. Like as you're building, different projects and releases, it's kind of like you're building a plane while landing at the same time. So sometimes you build like different types of architecture or different types of templates and go, oh yeah, this is the way that, we can set up for now and we'll fix it later. And before you have time to fix it, the game has already shipped. So I feel like, as a game developer, there's always a desire for that. But at the same time, as someone working on product, I understand that a lot of the things that game developers do are not necessarily seen or interpreted by players. So sometimes, the question of like, why is there a second iteration of that product? And sometimes it is obvious, like, oh yeah, here's a very different vision. Here's a very different, set of features that are adding. But sometimes to build that vision, or sometimes to build those sets of features, you had to go back and reinvent the wheel a little bit.
I'm curious to know if you were to look at yourself when you first started your career in visual effects and where you are today. I think that's been at least 10 years, right, Anton?
Oh man, I think so. I'm really bad at counting, I guess.
What would you tell your younger self so you could help them?
Oh man, I guess the meta advice is to take all pieces of advice with a grain of salt. I mean this because like a lot of experiences I had, 10 years ago are probably not going to be applicable today, or it was just a very different landscape. And I think every generation of artists has had this type of talk or this type of disclaimer as well. Like if you talk to people and from a generation older than mine, they're going to tell you, oh man, I just kind of got in because I knew how to use Max and Maya, and then I was the only kid around. And then, later on, it's like, oh, you got to like focus on this one specific thing and be known for that thing. And now, it's a weird hodgepodge of like promoting yourself over social media and so on and so forth. So I'd take these points with a bit of a grain of salt. That said, one thing I'd say is to realize or to accept that it does take a little while to get good at visual effects. There's this weird, curve when you first start building it where everything doesn't feel right at first because everything just feels off. You kind of internalize or take for granted what good visual effects look like. And it takes, sometimes like a year or two for certain people before you start building the kind of content that people can go, aha, this kind of looks like what it's supposed to look like. A lot of it's because visual effects is kind of this weird discipline where it is literal smoke and mirrors, We can't compute a lot of different things accurately. So we just have to fake a lot of things. And the ability to fake things is kind of intuitive initially. I'd say also that a lot of artists, when they think about art, they think, oh man, it has to be this completely original thing. It has to be a thing I've built from scratch and everything. I'd argue the opposite, where there's no shame in copy pasting, especially when you're first starting off. If you're able to recycle as hard as you can initially, then it means you're spending less time trying to figure out why things are broken or why things are not behaving the way they're not supposed to. So at that point, you're able to spend more time from that starting point to really figure out the bits and tools and to transform into something unique. It's kind of instead of trying to design a car from scratch, you're kind of buying something off the shelf and then you're trying to modify things here and there to your liking until you understand more and more about how cars are built. So the ability to copy paste early on really helps you focus and figure out how to pick your battles to be able to create the kind of content that you'd be proud of someday. Another thing I'd say would be to show your work in progress early. I'd say that transparency is super important in developing content. I am often guilty of trying to keep things under wraps for a cool reveal, hey guys, this is what I've worked on or whatever.
But I would be curious, just on that particular note, when you're showing your work in progress to others, is it better to release it in a public forum with lots of people that you may or may not know? Or do you feel it's better to choose very specific people to get feedback from?
I'd say specific people. I'm a big fan of being able to curate or target how your content is supposed to be built. Because the problem of having that be posted onto a public forum or whatever is that once you start aggregating the feedback of a lot of people that you may not know who they are or where they come from, you end up having a lot of the more the same type of visuals. It's hard to kind of build that unique look or that unique identity if you don't have that context of what you're trying to create as something aspirational or new for someone else to discover. Another piece of advice I'd say is to write documentation whenever you can. It's kind of this weird thing that people think it's super boring, but trust me, people tend to retain information faster, if they're trying to teach other people. And you can do that indirectly by just typing it out for yourself. And then you start examining oh, I am being redundant. These parts of the process don't work. Or you can also have other people read that documentation and also kind of peer review it. They kind of go, oh yeah, we don't do this anymore. Or yeah, I didn't know this part of the process worked out. Have you tried considering for these use cases or whatever? So it kind of becomes this weird, safe, evolving of medium where through that written word, it becomes stronger and people within your workplace or whatever can really build something off of it. And the final less intuitive piece of advice is that if you ask for people in general to ask for advice, like in this case, people will usually take forever to answer. But if you actively present suggestions, people will be very quick to offer valuable opinions. So, for example, you're working in a group setting, and then you need to have some sort of art leadership or direction, to chime in or something. If from the start you can't ask them what do you want me to do exactly? It may be hard to get a hold of time. But if you send them a screenshot of red flashing cubes and it's so obviously something that's temp or whatever, they will have some sort of gut reaction to it, and they will be happy to tell you exactly what they feel about it. And from there, you can just really get a fast turnaround on what you're trying to build, which kind of goes to a previous point about showing work in progress early.
I think that's a really good feedback. Oftentimes, when you are sharing your work with others, if you keep it very general, like you say, hey, what do you think of this effect? It's hard to be able to provide that feedback because what you think is so ambiguous. So when you have very specific questions, you're like, hey, I made this effect. What is your first impression? Where are areas of improvement? What is one thing you liked about it? What's one thing you didn't like about it? Now you have these more specific questions, which make it easier for the reviewer to give you the feedback that you actually want to get from it.
Absolutely. Being able to set yourself up for that kind of success is part of that game development process. It's kind of like the ability to make sure you're getting pertinent information, whether it's like, researching online or researching with internal documentation or asking the right people. And once you ask the right people, learning to ask those right questions is fundamental to that kind of success.
I know that when you are in a company already and you have an art director, a creative director, or a client, if you're in the freelance space, they typically give you direction and sometimes resources to be able to achieve a particular effect. But let's say you're trying to get into visual effects and you're self-learning. Can you just describe to me and Tim, what is your learning style? How do you go about learning how to do a new effect, whether it be a waterfall or a holographic projector or a muzzle flash? What are your thoughts on that?
I came from the modeling background in a more professional sense. Obviously, I waffled around a lot, before getting to that point. But because of my familiarity with being able to block out things, I often just try to block it out. If there's a waterfall, I'm going to start trying to model what the waterfall looks like in terms of shape or volume to kind of visualize, where I can go from there. So if a waterfall, for example, I think in terms of here's a waterfall mesh, here are UVs, this is how you scroll things based off of that. And then from there, I'll be able to work off camera angles here and there. But in a more abstract sense, how do I learn? How do I figure things out? A lot of it is just from doing and failing over and over again, It's kind of the idea that if you just kind of watch videos here and there, I'm not going to retain that information as well, or not find those opportunities as much unless I just do it. But furthermore, once you build something, then you have assets to work with. So then you can recycle those nodes, those textures or whatever, and carry over those systems to something else. So maybe with water, you figured out, how to fake a fluid simulation from there. And then you can start translating that towards clouds, towards smoke, towards other areas that have this type of property. And that's how you start reinventing or researching and building your knowledge based off of the ability to abstract motion and to be able to abstract readability. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. You typically curate some kind of reference through observation or online sources for whenever you're putting together an effect?
I do that a lot, actually. I guess for visual effects, you try to get video over still images, but I try not to be a slave to it. And what I mean by that is that I guess it depends on what kind of project you're working on. If you're working on something like a Call of Duty project or whatever, you are trying to go for extremely realistic visuals. So an explosion has to look like a tough explosion, but there's still some amount or some degree of choice making you're doing in there, where maybe you want to have a type of version of it. Maybe it's a gasoline explosion. Maybe it is an electrical explosion, or so forth. So you have to make those discrete choices, and you have to identify how do you break it down into those types of visuals or those types of particulates, elemental elements, or whatever. When it comes to something more stylized in terms of space magic or whatever, I guess what helps me out is also imagining visual metaphors. So it's not enough to just say, all right, this thing is smoke-like. Smoke-like in what way? Is it smoke-like something is just burned, and therefore you're really anchoring to that visual language of stuff that's just burned? Is smoke it's cold vapor, in which case you're gonna look more into things are related to ice, and therefore really hammered down onto that type of thing? Or is it a literal visual metaphor because maybe it's I'm thinking of some old GDC talk about Diablo 3, I think, where I think there's some ability where they literally struck a bell and then the bell had some cool effect or whatever. So at that point, they're all right, cool. The literal metaphor is a bell, and therefore, there's sound waves and stuff in this thing. So you're trying to overlap a lot of that vocabulary to build something a bit more complex, something that has a bit more visual storytelling than just literally just reference.
I think too, Joseph Gilliard said in his Elemental Magic Volume 1 book that the natural world is way too complex. And as artists, it's our duty to be able to simplify those elements like fluids or fire, because if we were to try and hand draw them exactly, we would be there for millennia trying to get every single little detail with our pen strokes.
Hey, great. That's actually a really good insight. I should carry that over.
I want to ask you about role models, Tim. Can you tell me any game companies, video games, people in VFX or not that have really inspired and influenced you in your own work, in your own career?
Oh, man, I got a lot of people I look up to. I'd say that, in terms of my life in general, my biggest role model had been my dad.
Jackie Chan. Oh, sorry, your dad.
Jackie Chan, for sure, he was a role model while growing up. Jackie Chan was definitely like this funny guy who would just try things over and over again. He wasn't the best in terms of like his movie roles. He wasn't like the strong hero protagonist who was like the guy who just didn't want no trouble or whatever. But I do pick my dad over Jackie Chan though.
All right.
A lot of it is that my dad, he's a very smart, funny guy, super witty or whatever. Travels a lot, but he also has his own crazy backstory. Like he survived the Vietnam War as a kid or a young adult, and he lost a lot of things. I guess he lost almost everything. He had to escape by boat, with people and stuff. And from there, eventually he ended up in France, and he had to build his life from scratch. He was an immigrant, himself as a refugee, and he had to figure out, how to live in that world and how to survive. And he, at the end of the day, he ended up being really successful in his business field. And the way that he talks and the way he cherishes life, he really enjoys making people laugh. He loves being a people pleaser. He's the kind of person that you'd want to hang out more with and to learn more, because he'd always have something to share and has experiences to offer. I guess for a lot of people who don't know him, he kind of gives off this minor Anthony Bourdain type of vibe, and that always brought a smile to my face. So whenever I feel wondering hey, how do I conduct myself in life? How do I, talk to people, whatever? I think about him a lot. So he was a huge inspiration in my life. And I think that type of personality and characteristic has also been pretty instrumental, in terms of my early career, how to network with people, how to talk to people, how to make sure that I'm able to convey across, what I'm trying to build, or how to understand people and how to make sure they feel comfortable working with me.
Is he in France right now?
It's actually in Vietnam.
Okay.
Yeah, my family's all over the place. Yeah.
Can you describe to me what a day in the life of Tim looks like from sunrise to sunset? When do you wake up in the morning and what do you do?
Oh man, I guess it's kind of weird, with COVID right now. So I'm mostly staying at home versus wandering around and everything. But yeah, I'll walk you through it. I'd say that, I try to get to work at 9, 10 a.m., more like 10 a.m. if we're really being honest, If I try to get up a bit earlier, get a protein shake or breakfast, waffles or whatever, just to make sure that, I kind of put myself in the mental mindset to be able to talk to people, make sure that I'm on the ball on things, because I do try to present my best version of myself to others when I can. And it also depends on what day of the week it is. Usually once a week, I try to also catch up with family a little bit before starting work. So I have a bit of a video call or whatever. Say, hey, just want to say hi, miss you and everything. It kind of starts the day with a good high note. Towards lunchtime, I usually work out. I built a home gym during COVID. I hope my neighbors, don't hate me too much, because I do live in an apartment. But it's been really good for me, especially for my mental health, to be able to make sure that I am active, that I am taking care of myself. And I also have this recurring video chat, with a bunch of friends over Discord. A lot of them are game devs from around the world who also wanted to make sure that they were, holding each other accountable and stuff. And it's kind of this cool hangout, that for an hour a day, we just, say hi and we're just working out together. After that, it depends if I have if a meeting afterwards, then I just go to that meeting for a bit. Or if I don't have a meeting right away, then I'll try to sneak in a quick shower and then have a quick meal. Usually, the quick meal is just something I've already prepared over the weekend. I do a lot of meal prepping and stuff. Saves me time, gives me more time to work out, because of that. And then I usually get a lot of my visual effects work in there until about 5 or 6 p.m. It kind of depends on how much work I get done. Sometimes at the end of the day, I just feel man, I don't want to think about this anymore. I'll be faster if I just postpone this for tomorrow and then I'll bust it out later. Or maybe I'm just in the zone going, oh man, if I don't finish this thing right now, I'm going to forget it completely what I was building. So I keep myself a bit of that fungibility, as long as I get my work done, my CEO, gives me much of that flexibility. And after work, I usually I spend like an hour or two just actively avoiding, browsing and, online interactions and stuff. The idea is just get my mind off the computer and just kind of like make sure there's kind of this clear division between like my work environment and my home environment. So it can go, it's basically anything from trying to cook something more complex for dinner or just literally watching Netflix or HBO.
Now that you're living at home pretty much all the time, have you brought in any companions to keep your sanity, or are you in complete isolation? And when I say that, I mean family members, whether they be human or pets.
My family, most of my family, I'd say they live out of state or abroad. So I've actually been like completely isolated, more or less, for the entirety of COVID since March last year. So it's been almost a year.
Oh, man.
Give or minus 1 week, which again, making sure that I prioritize self-care has been like extremely helpful for me. If I didn't restructure my life around, then it'd be a lot harder to go through. But I'm doing weirdly fine compared to a lot of friends I have. So I think I'm doing something right.
Living in Washington, you've got a lot of open air and mountains and countryside, right? So are you able to get outside ever?
I used to do a lot of hiking. I used to go outside a lot. It's just that, how do I put it? I do notice that a lot of my neighbors don't wear masks.
Gotcha. So
yeah, it's a bit tough.
Yeah.
I think also early on, I lived like near a retirement home, and I used to hear like the sirens going on and on like a lot.
Mm-hmm.
The first case of COVID that we know in the U.S. started off in Washington, like within the area. So we were just like ground zero at some point, and I hit a little bit close to home. So I've been very careful since.
Let's pray that these vaccines come out and we can return to some semblance of a normal life again.
I agree.
I'm sure you and your coworkers want to get together and grab some coffee or beers once again. I didn't know if the Bungie has like a cafeteria, but I do like those water cooler talks.
Yeah, we had a kitchen. I know we announced that we were doing some construction here and there, so we'll see if it's still a kitchen or if there's something like crazier out of it. It's going to be a surprise for everyone.
I want to talk about some of the specifics, starting with your idea of what we call spectacle assets when referring to the kind of FX that you like to make, which seems to be, to me, a little bit more of a technical undertone than what a typical artist may think of. Can you talk to me a little bit about this concept of spectacle assets and how you go about making your own effects or that R&D process to developing new features to achieve those goals?
So I had to think about this because spectacle, when I mentioned spectacle assets, I didn't really think about the technical aspect first and foremost. Like the reason why I tend to refer to it as spectacle assets is because it's supposed to be like a somewhat informal term, but it describes exactly what that asset needs to achieve. Previously, I talked about certain effects assets that are not designed to be noticed, but to be felt. So like the example, the gun muzzle flash. If you notice the muzzle flash itself, you're not paying attention to combat. You're just noticing just the muzzle flash. And that's like one example of something that you're not really supposed to be noticing. But a spectacle asset is meant to be noticed. It's not just felt, but it's also seen. And if it does its job right, it also inspires a sense of awe and wonder. So a spectacle asset for me is just has a target goal of standing out, of being identifiable, and to end up being memorable as an experience. But in terms of process of R&D and stuff, to be able to build that kind of content, sometimes, I'd find something online, or oh yeah, this is a really cool, visual that I'm seeing, abstract or not. Sometimes I hear about something really cool in another game, so I go play it and check it out and try to see, oh man, this is kind of cool. I want to guess how they built this magic trick. This is kind of fun. Or sometimes, or pretty often, there's a feature that needs to be built, and then I talk to the feature owner, usually a designer, sometimes an art director, or so on, who's trying to build something cool, and it ends up being your job to help elevate it to something that's even cooler than the initial prompt or a springboard. And you're just kind of going back and forth, in terms of trying to figure out what is technically possible with current knowledge and mindsets or whatever, and to kind of layer out, or fully flesh it out, what that experience could be. So when I go through this process of R&D, I often end up leveraging a lot of my technical familiarity with all of our content systems and prototyping things together, try to present that as early as possible, saying, hey, are there any concerns with this type of setup in this existing framework? Is this like super heavy on perf, super heavy on memory or whatever? And can we template this kind of cool aspect for later use for other artists to be able to use it or whatnot? And it's not like something that just me just doing this, as a cultural practice with our team, it's something that a lot of people do because it's just super fun. And importantly, like the most valuable thing out of this is that because of the fact that we work in a large team, I'm surrounded by a lot of smart people. And once they have visibility on that thing, they can start contributing to that as well, going, oh man, have you considered implementing this new tech in here? Or have you considered trying to use some sort of vector math related to this thing to be able to build this type of content? And we do this back and forth. Sometimes I see someone else's work, I try to broadcast something and so on, so that eventually whatever we end up building ends up being greater than like what any of us could have thought of initially. And that's just like the process of polish and iteration.
I love that. And back to your earlier comment, this idea of kit bashing, where you take existing pieces or assets and combine them to create brand new ones. It's a really magical phase of discovery.
Yeah, it's kind of like, from clay, you build something that becomes really identifiable and something that feels like, it is its own thing, even though you can very well trace where that thing came from. You're not trying to like reinvent life, but you are reliant on a lot of the processes that were required to build initial content towards this new revision of content.
I was wondering if there were any daily practices, mantras, or routines that you follow in your VFX workflow that keeps you on track and productive and really just being your best self in your craft.
Oh man, I'm not really sure. Like I know I do a lot of things like every now and then, like whenever I find like cool visual effects references, Twitter's really good at that. I tend to like share it around and try to build conversations with like engineering or tech art, trying to figure out, hey, if I was going to build something like this, like what systems do we have available to build this thing? Sometimes, or actually all the time, I'm always asking questions to everyone, even if they sound like really dumb questions. I have to just put my ego aside and just like realize that a lot of the things I ask are sometimes they illustrate like entire gaps of knowledge between different people, in which case we need to have more people chime in. Or sometimes the things I take for granted is just not obvious at all to someone else. And that's how we started examining things. So a lot of the improvement happens in there from just like going back and forth and making sure that you're as transparent as possible, because that's just how we operate culturally.
So one of the things you would say that you pride yourself is never being afraid to ask questions, especially for things you don't know. So when you have ideas and you don't feel like you know the answer, you can just go to somebody who you feel like would be able to answer it, like your programmers.
Right. There's been a lot of instances where I've definitely asked a lot of dumb math questions, but if I didn't ask those questions, I would probably still be really dumb at math still. So now I am maybe beginner level okay.
I understand as we move up in our careers, we go through this similar phase where we start off as a junior and work our way into senior and lead, and sometimes even more into supervisory positions. Maybe even the creative director someday, I don't know. Can you tell me a little bit about what that career progression trajectory may look like for a visual effects artist?
I think that from what I understand, the definition really varies from studio to studio. So take this with a grain of salt. This is my very crude understanding of what senior really means. From what I usually expect out of like other seniors is that I can't imagine them as a fire and forget missile. It's the idea that like they're able to kind of figure out things for themselves, once a task has been assigned to them. And it's kind of like this display of like methodology and awareness of available resources to be able to like operate in that sense independently, because they know exactly who to ask help from, because they know what things they can rely on in terms of like, workflow, what things are lower risk versus higher risk and so on. And it's super important, through the production process where things get murky, entire like features get pivoted or whatever, and they're able to handle themselves. Consequently, I think that like, because of that, a senior should also kind of be able to carry like features by themselves. I'm not saying, oh yeah, this is like an entire engineering thing that you have to do, and therefore the senior artist has to build engineering. No, I'm saying that like if there's like a kind of a bullet point on the box or whatever, so to speak, that they're able to handle all sorts of aspects related to that feature, and they're able to carry that like, short of like making project-wide decisions, And I think that, another, not like, super critical, but like kind of important part still, that their work should help raise the quality bar of the industry, just as like, a kind of a general practice, like they're not there to create the bleeding edge of every single thing of the industry standard, but that they're still trying to aim to make something that people go, oh man, this is kind of cool. This is like, this feels nice. So I guess like, this is a little bit abstract or whatever, but like if I had to give like a main piece of advice for artists, if they're hunting for that senior promotion, if they're trying to figure out like, what does it take to go from, mid-tier to senior or whatever, it's the value of being able to say no. It sounds kind of intuitive, because you're thinking, oh man, I have to say yes to every single opportunity to prove myself and to learn how to get better at this. But like saying yes to everything is kind of this weird, surefire way of like setting yourself up for failure, because it kind of demonstrates an inability to carry difficult conversations. Some requests or some things are just really hard to build and to carry forward. And if you're not able to question or not able to say, hey, here's the line in the sand because this is the trade-off that you need to start having, then you're not really having an honest conversation with your teammates. So setting yourself up for success is just as important as being able to do the work.
When people typically get promoted, they find themselves having to mentor junior staff and sometimes hold them accountable for their output. Have you ever found yourself in a position where you have to basically watch over other artists and be their mother or their father hen in your case?
Not in my current job, but definitely in a previous job. Like for example, at a previous job, I had to like help integrate a lot of outsourced assets, and a lot of my job was like doing a lot of technical setup to make sure that doors were animating, that, glass was breaking and so on and so forth. And I guess at the time, like there weren't really like schools or anything to really teach you that kind of specific part of the setup of things. Those are usually things I had to learn online, documentation or whatever. So a lot of the people that we started hiring for this type of roles, they required some amount of time to learn how these things worked. But sometimes you don't have the luxury of like, having them be onboarded by themselves. So you're there to kind of help guide them and go, all right, here are the ropes and follow my lead. And this is how we build things. So I've definitely been in those type of shoes, but I don't think I ever had to be like really responsible for someone. Like if they mess up, then it's my fault.
Okay. VFX is your core. And I know most people think of it as just drawing, but programming can also help in the craft. So I was curious if you had some examples of ways that VFX artists can apply programming skills to be better at their jobs.
So I'd say that, visual effects, usually people think is purely like a visual component, like you have to apply, the principles of animation, you have to apply, the fundamentals of design or whatever to be able to have something read well and to really like work with the player, experience and, the whole applied psychology behind it or whatever. But a lot of what makes visual effects also interesting is that sometimes it is also anchored on what kind of systems you can build for those things to work. Like if you need to have something that work based off of an interact prompt, if you're trying to build something based off like a calendar gated event or whatever, then being able to build that kind of content, to make it work for that type of performance is super important. I remember for a while, like at one point we were building like these activities and stuff. And some of the role overlaps we had to do was to like build a lot of these test and setup maps where you would have to like, load a map and then you would be able to trigger things over and over again in order to be able to visualize what you're actually building. Things get even more complicated where I know maybe you're working on a raid mechanic or whatever, so that one player can see something that other players cannot. So that's where things get complicated, but that's how you end up like stubbing in a lot of things for designers to be able to prototype, for players to be able to playtest and try to figure out, hey, this works and this doesn't. And sorting those questions early on is conducive to success. Like, was it worth spending all this time towards something that is an uphill battle? Or are there easier ways and more clearer ways to be able to have that content be represented and to be called on?
One of the biggest benefits in addition to that is time. you save so much time when you can do these changes yourself rather than having to wait for a programmer on your team to get around to being able to implement a request that you ask.
Absolutely. And it also really helps in terms of general fluency. Like if you're asking engineers and programmers like how to build types of content or whatnot, like understanding how their systems work to learn how to communicate from their perspective is incredibly valuable.
I'm just thinking about the times I've had to talk with engineers on my own team, and they bring these concepts like we use Jira as our project management system here, and they're always talking about Python scripts and these different like numeral values with like brackets and things, and sometimes it just kind of goes over my head, so I don't really get like divs and CSS components and things like that. Okay, man, I want to jump into a topic on formal education. I know you went to the Art Institute of California in Orange County and got a BS in game art and design. People are always wondering what is the value in an education. So I'm curious to know what for you were the highlights and lowlights of the college experience. And in today's day and age, is the money worth the degree?
I'll definitely put a disclaimer out there where like I feel like the college experience I had may not be representative or reflective of like what a lot of people are maybe going through. So I don't think there's like a one blanket general answer in terms of like, is college worth it or not? In certain countries, having a degree is kind of just primary requirement to be able to be considered for jobs or even for work visas and stuff. But because I went to the Art Institute like in the US, I can comment from that perspective, especially for a for-profit school. For people who don't know, the Art Institute is kind of this weird tarnished label because, well, it was sued by the US government at one point for defrauding students. It was like, it was to the point where like, it was bad. Enrollment dropped really hard at one point. So they basically shut down most of the campuses, including mine in Orange County. So that school doesn't exist anymore. I think my degree might have had some minor regional accreditation, but like, I'm not sure if it kicked in by the time I had graduated. I think it's safe to say that for my specific case, like the degree I had is kind of worthless despite all the money that got into it. There was kind of this running joke among like the students at the time where the short name for our institute is AI. So you can't spell fail without AI. That being said, positive takeaways or whatever, it was compared to like a lot of my peers, whatever, I'd say that it was a pretty unique experience because I feel that, for a lot of us who went to that school, there were obviously a lot of people who were procrastinating a lot. And they just kind of like told themselves that like, hey, I just do the bare minimum. I'm going to get a job, whatever. But for many of us who knew that, somewhere down the line that like is going to be super hard for us because our school is not preparing ourselves at all for the job market, did not have the luxury of being individualists. When I hear about like other types of art schools, sometimes I've heard things, like students are really competitive against one another, like they don't see themselves as friends. They really see themselves as like rivals or worse, but for us, we just didn't have the luxury, we were just really open with one another about our struggles. And we just radically shared everything we could, as much knowledge as we had, tutorial resources, reviewing each other's work, networking contacts, like anything we could do to collaborate to survive. Like it was kind of this mentality of like, if you win, then I win because you can help me out later on. So we just have to have each other's back no matter what. And because of that, we just built kind of this super collaborative culture at the time where we were building like, team projects and stuff when it wasn't super commonplace to build team projects as a student. I'd say like maybe like 15 years ago at this point, but it was kind of cool because like, we were really operating collaboratively versus like just trying to gun after one another. That being said, that seems like a very optimistic view of like how things happened. School, is, I was basically a zombie. I was sleeping 4 hours every 2 days. So,
oh my goodness.
Yeah, I gained a bunch of weight, from it. There was like,
were you working another job on top of your classes or were they just that demanding?
The classes themselves weren't exactly demanding, but there's kind of like this understanding that like, if you're going to class and just learning things step by step, then you don't have enough time to get better at it, to master it, to implement it to other projects and so on and so forth. So I was like, not only trying to pass my classes, but also like work on team projects on the side to make sure that we we're building content that we can understand better, that was easier to present to professionals. That again, harkening back towards what we understood how to collaborate, that we had to drive our own collaboration outside of the curriculum. And we had this weird saying that don't let school in the way of your education. It's kind of a weird saying.
It's very ironic.
It is. It absolutely is. So I can't really thank my college, for my success. But I will say that it created an environment in which I was able to strive. And from all these struggles and failures or whatever, it really helped cement my proficiency in all sorts of different areas. And I guess to this day, it's been a key to my success.
For the students that you were able to collaborate, even today, are you still in contact with some of them, or has everybody moved on?
Absolutely. A lot of them work in the game industry now because we were able to help each other that much.
Rock on.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
All right, Antim, we are ready to jump into the lightning round questions. Right. Quick and easy, just like visual effects. What is a perfect one-day getaway in Issaquah, Washington, and the surrounding area?
We have a lot of outdoor spots. We're surrounded by mountains, lakes, and waterfalls. So I used to go hiking, photography. I used to do photography a lot, especially in the northern and central Cascades. Or sometimes I just go to the Olympic National Rainforest during the summer. What video game or app are you using on your phone that is the most fun? I've been mostly using Discord, because of COVID. I don't really play games that much on my phone, but the last one I grabbed was Battle Chasers, which was on sale, and it was beautiful. I'm also really addicted to turn-based RPGs, so there's that. What is your favorite thing to cook or eat? I can eat sushi any day of the week. I just love sushi. What kind of sushi rolls do you like? Oh man, anything with salmon. I think that's my favorite fish right there. What is your favorite book or podcast you've listened to recently? I haven't done much reading recently because I used to just take the bus and go to work. But that being said, the one that stands out the most to me right now in my mind is the Inserto series by Nicholas Nassim Taleb. What's it about? It's about behavioral economics. Okay, nonfiction? Nonfiction. Okay. More philosophy. You and Jason Kaiser would get along well. He's really getting into that spiritual environment right now. Nice. Favorite video game visual effect you're jealous of that isn't your own? I don't know which to pick between the crazy mind warpy thing from Control or the giant Yggdrasil tree from God of War. Best advice for a first-time visual effects artist or people looking to get into the industry? You can achieve great animation timing in visual effects by making mouth noises. It's true. I'm going to have to try and do that in practice now. Yeah. What are you most excited about for the future of visual effects? I'm excited about the fact that we haven't figured out what the ceiling is yet. There are so many ways to innovate in visual effects, and we just haven't figured it out yet. So it's discovering while building things at the same time. There's an anime I have watched. I can't remember the name of it. I want to say Kill La Kill. No, it's probably not that one. But the beginning of the story starts with this little boy, and he's underground, and he's been living underground for years and years and years and years. And apparently there's this alien robot species that's trapping the humans. And eventually what we discover throughout the anime series is that humans have untapped potential to become the masters of the universe. And I always think about that, how as a race, we have so much potential to achieve greatness. And hearing your comment earlier reminded me of that anime. You're thinking about Gurren Lagann. It's yes, not, that one. Yeah. That one. Gurren Lagann. It's so good. What question do you never get asked that you wish you were asked more often? How to have a good time. Life is long. Sometimes a struggle. It makes it feel long. But how do you enjoy life? Antim, how do you enjoy life? One step at a time. Giving yourself easy to accomplish goals. Make friends. There you go. The secret to life in 3 steps. All right. Any final thoughts or things you want to plug? Projects you're working on? People you want to give a shout out to? Anything on your mind? I want to say thanks to my friends, family, and coworkers for the support. Keep wearing masks during COVID. And also, I guess, stand up against anti-Asian violence that's been on the rise since COVID, which is unfortunate, but make sure that people are aware of it. That's a start. Anton, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. It's been awesome talking to you today. Thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for listening to today's episode with Mr. Antim.
It is an incredible time to be alive, and I keep thinking about how Antim said his father was his role model, and how earlier Brian had said the same thing about his mom. Our families are so important to our upbringing because they teach us so many lessons on how to view the world. So here's a homework assignment. Think about something very important in your own upbringing that maybe your mom or your siblings or your father had taught you that has made you into the man or woman you are today. I'd love to hear about some of those life lessons, and I want you to also, if you're in good relations, reconnect with them and tell them how much you love them. It's important that we stick together as both a VFX family, but also with our immediate blood family as well. Alright guys, we are moving into the March season, which means it's going to be spring break for some of the kiddos, which means the adults who are stuck at home are going to have their hands full once again. So keep your chin up, stay positive, and do some spring cleaning, eh? Rock on!